Well, in a big bonanza for the government, the Reserve Bank of India has decided to transfer 1.76 lakh crores to the government. This comes after RBI accepted the Bimal Jalan committee recommendations. Now, the expert panel was constituted to review the method by which the RBI determines its excess funds, known as the Economic Capital Framework. This panel was set up in 2018 after the issue of RBI's excess reserves and how much should be transferred to the government became a bone of contention between the RBI and the government, and that eventually led to the resignation of the then governor, Urjit Patel.
I wouldn't say it's a balancing act. We've done a technical report taking everything into account, and I think arrived at the principles that we proposed, which have clearly been accepted by both the government and the Reserve Bank. According to the RBI press release, they've taken the lower bound of the range of 5.5%, and they are deciding to transfer the full amount in excess. So obviously there's nothing left for another tranche. I've obviously not seen the final accounts of the RBI for 2018-19, but from the press release, I gathered that they've taken the lower bound of 5.5%, and as a consequence, calculated the excess, and they're transferring the full amount this year. And therefore, there's no other tranche left. The surplus transfer for next year will depend on whatever surplus the Reserve Bank has for 2019-20, and then they will have to look at the reserves at that point in time, what proportion they are on the balance sheet. Suppose they're less than 5.5%, then they'll have to retain part of the surplus so that the minimum 5.5% is maintained. They can also transfer more. They can also transfer more if they want to increase the reserves to 6.5 to the limit of 6.5%. That'll depend on the Reserve Bank board.
Let's in fact get in some more perspective on this. Santosh Mehrotra, economist, joining me on the phone line. Mr. Mehrotra, thank you for joining us. Your reaction to this figure, because obviously this is higher than what was being worked with, what experts perhaps were expecting, and what even the government was working with.
Correct. But it seems that the government is following the Bimal Jalan panel's recommendation. And given the credibility of Dr. Jalan and Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who is himself a former deputy governor of the RBI, I think the government is taking a judgment call which perhaps will be good for the economy. This is a one-off gain that is accruing. Such a large gain has almost never accrued to the government.
Yes.
Because, well, let's not go into because the point really is that at the current moment, all surplus funds are likely to be transferred, plus some part of the revaluation funds will also be. So we will now have a situation where the reserve assets of the RBI, which have been running at something like 30-31% of its balance sheet, which is not atypical of developing countries. This kind of share of 31% is not found in developed countries where it's much lower. So what the government has decided to bring this down to roughly about 20% from 31%. And this is an unprecedented move, clearly called for by the quite, very tight situation that that the government of India is facing, because all the engines that the economy are not allowing for much room for optimism. And the government's own fiscal deficit was such that it needs to maintain a fiscal consolidation path. So really, in some ways, the government will need to act on its promise of selling land, meaning monetizing the assets that it has in public sector undertakings and railways and so on. And it will have to divest as well because it needs to be able to generate other resources. Because we know that given the state of the economy, tax revenues are not going to be very significant.
Right.
So that's the situation. Essentially, that's what this one-off windfall gain has been. That's why it's been called for. And
Right.
it's a good thing, and I'm hoping that all of this goes towards public investment, because public investment in the budget was actually for 1920 was
Right.
scheduled to go down from 1.4% of GDP, which was very low as it is, to 1.3% of GDP.
Right.
Yeah, that's
right.
it. That's it.
All right. All right, Mr. Raja. Thank you so much for your quick perspective on that.